your thoughts about today. You know the terrain. How physically difficult might this exchange be? We're talking about this Rafah crossing, aren't we? What's the geography like there?
I don't think it's physically demanding. I think what we've got is a very fragile ceasefire. We've got two sides at war. That ceasefire will hopefully hold for as long as it possibly can. What you're going to see in the next hour, as the world holds its breath, is 13 Israeli hostages taken to southern Gaza by Hamas, handed to the International Red Cross at an undisclosed location. The International Red Cross will then transfer them to the Rafah crossing, over the crossing into Egypt, where they'll be met by Israeli Defence Forces. Those Israeli Defence Forces will then transport them, presumably by helicopter, back over the border from Egypt into southern Israel to an air base, where they will be assessed medically, mentally and physically. It will be a very difficult process, because you have to remember that of these 13 hostages, there are 240 odd in total. These hostages were caught up in the wholesale murder of Israelis on October the 7th, but they don't yet know that their communities were torched and that their neighbours and their family members were also murdered. So they'll be then moved from that airbase once the initial checks have been done, and they'll be moved to one of 7 Israeli hospitals where the health checks will continue, but also the Health Ministry of Israel are very keen to document any signs of torture, rape and mistreatment, war crimes.
I mean, there had been concerns and criticisms raised by the far right in Israel's parliament over this particular deal, suggesting that actually perhaps Hamas were getting the better end of this deal, that it was giving them an opportunity to regroup. There's been a huge debate over whether or not fuel supplies should be sent into the territory, with the IDF saying, well, look, we've done that and we think they misappropriate it for fighting purposes. It's not going where it's needed. I mean, how nervous are the IDF in terms of Hamas sticking to their side of the bargain and potentially using this opportunity to come back fighting even more fiercely?
I think that's why the world is holding its breath. Israel is dealing with a terrorist organisation. They're completely untrustworthy. What they carried out, what they did on October the 7th is beyond anything I think any of us have ever seen or witnessed. It is truly horrific. So yes, the world holds its breath. If today goes well, then we'll see more hostages released over the next 3 days. So over 4 days, we will see up to 50 hostages released in return for 150 Palestinian women and children. If that holds, if the ceasefire holds and those hostages are returned and they keep to their word, we could then see 5 further days where 10 hostages per day will be released. So by the time we get to 9 days, we could see 100 Israeli hostages released in return for 300 Palestinians. And I think what's key for the Israeli government, it were very, very, very keen to express at the start that this was a war on terror. They didn't want, and they weren't allowed to forget that there were 240 Israeli hostages. They are doing absolutely everything they can, and that has to be their priority, to get those hostages home. So whilst there is a cessation in fighting, and Hamas can regroup, so too will the IDF.
Paul, the 150 Palestinian prisoners, I mean, where are they now and how will that handover happen? So
they're currently incarcerated in Israeli prisons.
In Israel?
In
Israel?
Yeah, okay. In Israeli prisons. So some of them, majority of them are from the West Bank. So an exchange will take place. The Israeli Defence Forces haven't exactly laid out the framework for where they will go, who they'll be handed to. But yeah, they'll be released from prison shortly after, once Israel have the 13 hostages in their possession.
Sorry, Alex. Will that happen over 4 days as well?
Each day, what you'll see is 12 to 13 hostages, Israeli hostages, released each day in return for 39 Palestinian prisoners who are held within Israeli jails. So if that continues for 9 days, that is the hope. You'll eventually see 100 Israeli hostages who were snatched by Hamas on October the 7th, released in return for 300 Palestinians.
Various observers of Middle Eastern situations have pointed out the last time there was such a prisoner swap, the man who actually masterminded the 7th of October attack was one of the people released. The optics really matter for both sides in this. I mean, the last time that Hamas did hand over hostages, it seemed to be very deliberate on who they picked. People suggesting perhaps that these hostages were sort of scripted to say, we were treated extremely well, thank you very much. That iconic video of the grandmother shaking hands with her captors, perhaps told to do so because her husband remained incarcerated. I mean, how do optics and this sort of wider global propaganda war play into this particular exchange?
I think we've seen for the last 2 to 3 weeks that this has not only been a war fought on the ground, but it's also been a war fought over the internet through reports. It's become an information war. So for the Israeli government, it's extremely important. They've been pressured by the families of those hostages repeatedly to prioritise the release of the 240-odd hostages who are being held. Hamas are also fighting an information war. They've issued figures to say that 14,000 Palestinians have been killed since the war began. Those figures are disputed by the Israelis. They say that they don't believe that to be true. So we are very much in an information war. The optics are extremely important. The images that we see coming back, I mean, on both sides, in Gaza and in Israel, are horrific. David Cameron, Lord Cameron, visited Be'eri yesterday, said that he'd seen things that he would probably never, ever forget, things that he'd never seen before. I can totally align myself with that. I've seen those videos. I've seen those photographs. They're not broadcastable, they're not publishable because they're so graphic. And they really, I mean, they are horrific videos to see. So there is, at the moment, there is an information war. What Israel will do in the next hour, once the hostages are released, is that they will release images and live footage of those hostages being released. And I think that will be welcome news to lots of the families. But we also must remember that for the families of the 13 hostages that are released today, there are countless other families whose loved ones are still being held captive in the lair beneath Gaza.